and then we will have a Q&A session. And then sometime, I guess, towards the end, the president of the university and the dean will come in, and at that moment we will also announce the order of the winners. I mean, our panelists are all winners of the first essay competition, and once the president comes in towards the end of our symposium, at the closing of it, the president will present the awards to the winners. So, so the order that you see on the flyers do not necessarily reflect the order of the winners. I mean, may or may not. I mean, we're not saying this. We're going to keep it suspenseful. But the order of the speakers was determined somewhat loosely historically. I guess Henry's paper is the first, because it goes back to I mean, 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottoman Empire, and Gita's paper is focused mostly on European accession process in the 90s, and Maris' paper is partly talking about Japan, Second World War, after Second World War, but also in Iraq, which is still ongoing. That's why there's a loose historical continuity, the development here. So we'll first start with Henry, the oldest, dealing with the oldest issues, and then Gita, and then Omer.
Okay. Shall I begin?
Please do.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. I don't have much visuals, just a little Word document with the names of the authors I'll be discussing. All right. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say that I'm very grateful to the organizers of this contest for creating a venue for us to present our research, especially Ms. Mevhibe Ateş and her family. Greatly honored to have been chosen among the winners, and delighted that the jury was willing to accept a project which falls outside of traditional disciplinary boundaries, lying at the intersection of history, philology, and political science. What I'm working to do in this paper is to understand the thoughts of early modern Greek chronicle writers regarding the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultanate. The question I ask is the following. Did Greek-speaking Christian intellectuals of the early modern Ottoman Empire believe that they were living under the rule of law? That is to say, did they believe that the Ottomans ruled legally and that the Ottoman state was legitimate? Unlike Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, or any of the other authors familiar to a student of Western European political theory, my authors wrote no Leviathan, no treatises of government, or any other explicitly political tracts. Rather, they wrote histories of the late Paleologoi, of ecclesiastical history, and of Ottoman history, and discernment of their views on political theory therefore requires careful searching, historical empathy, and understanding of these texts' place in the broad continuity of Greek literary history. That being said, I'll show that my authors do make their thoughts on political theory explicit. In the following 20 minutes, I'll present to you my findings on 9 Greek chronicle writers of the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. They are Doukas, George Phrontes, Critopoulos, and Chalcikondyles, writing in the 15th century, first bracketed there. The author of the Patriarchal History of Constantinople, Makarios Melisenos Melisurgos, and an anonymous author writing in the 16th century, the second group there. And the author of the Chronicle of Turkish Sultans, the anonymous chronicle, and the priest Papasinadinos, writing in the 17th century. Before entering discussion of these authors, however, I should take a moment to provide a theoretical framework through which to interpret these texts. In an essay entitled Legitimizing the Ottoman Sultanate, Hakan T. Karateke crafts a framework that is helpful for understanding Greek authors' views on the Ottoman state. He proposes the concept of, quote, tolerated legitimacy to explain how non-Muslims saw the Sultanate as legitimate in a fundamentally different way from Sunni Muslim subjects. There he describes a hypothetical Orthodox priest who could never sincerely accept the, quote, normative legitimacy of the Sultanate because of the religious divide between Muslims and Christians. That is to say, he could never believe that, quote, the Sultan is the ruler sent to us by God. He could only acknowledge a right to rule born mainly of fatalism. Karateke predicts that this would have been the dominant view of Orthodox Christian subjects in the Ottoman Empire. I think that Karateke is correct to distinguish between somebody who accepts the legitimacy of the state out of, quote, toleration or habit, because that's the way things are, from someone who can offer a normative theory of legitimation. It was not my finding, however, that there was a preponderance of authors who accepted Ottoman legitimacy only out of fatalism. In my reading of Ottoman Greek literature of the early modern period, I've come across a pretty wide range of views on the topic of Ottoman legitimacy. While some authors have been to views similar to the habitual legitimacy described by Karateke, others imply that the Sultanate was absolutely illegal, while still others develop theories of legitimacy for the Ottomans that can be considered normative. I'll divide this talk into three sections based along these three categories. Firstly, let me address authors who considered the Ottoman Sultanate to be illegal. Because of time restrictions, I'll limit my comments to discussion of Dukas, the 15th century historian. Dukas was an aristocrat who descended from the famous Byzantine Dukas family and spent most of his life working for the Genoese in New Phoika and on the island of Lesbos. He wrote a chronicle focusing on Byzantine and Ottoman history between the years 1341 and 1362, in which he makes his belief in the illegitimacy of the Ottoman Sultanate quite unambiguous. He does this through his description of Ottoman sultans and Turks in general, and through classical allusion and vocabulary. To Dukas, Ottoman sultans were vicious lechers and enemies of the Christian faith. He describes Bayezid I as an arch-enemy of Christians who, quote, did not sleep, spending his nights in deliberation and machinations against the flock of Christ. Dukas accuses Musa of being a cannibal who feasted upon Christian cadavers, and he believed that Suleiman Çelebi was a coward in battle and a debauched drunk. He loathed Mehmet II most of all, and repeatedly refers to him as, quote, the Antichrist, considering him to be the enemy of the cross. Overall, he believed that it was, quote, the ancient design of Turks to vigorously oppose Christians and to raise up trophies against them, for the nation of the Turks is, like no other, fond of rape and injustice. In addition to showing general anti-Ottoman bias, Dukas also borrows technical vocabulary from classical Greek literature, namely Thucydides, to contrast Byzantine and Ottomans. For example, in the 5th century BCE, Thucydides describes the rise of tyranny in ancient Greek city-states and contrasted the term kingship, or basileia in Greek, which is, quote, based upon stated prerogatives, with tyranny, or tyrannis, which is not. Throughout his history, Dukas also uses the same vocabulary to contrast Byzantines and Ottomans. He always uses, for example, the word basileos, or emperor, to refer to the Byzantine potentates, whereas he generally uses the term tyrannos, or tyrant, to refer to Ottoman sultans. These terms are often placed in juxtaposition, hinting at a belief in the legitimacy of Byzantine rule and the illegitimacy of Ottoman rule. Other authors who shared Dukas's disregard for the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultanate include George Frantes, Makarios Melisenos Melisurgos, and the anonymous author of a 16th century chronicle which explicitly refers to the Ottomans as being lawless. Now I'll move on to discuss one author who considered the Ottomans to be legitimate out of habit, to borrow Hakan Karateke's term, before addressing four authors who offer legitimizing discourses for the Ottomans. The only author I found who conveys belief in the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultanate without also offering the intellectual bases of his claim is the anonymous author of the Chronicle of Turkish Sultans of the 17th century. This chronicle is a collection of biographies of Ottoman sultans, which was written, as I said, in the 17th century, and its crude Greek and lack of classical or religious references implies that the author was uneducated in ecclesiastical or classical tradition. It is often said to be the voice of the Greek common man, based on his language. The strongest evidence regarding the author's views on the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultanate derives from the structure of the chronicle, the author's choice of terminology for describing sultans, and his assessment of the character of Ottoman sultans' character at the end of each biography. To write a book of biographies of Ottoman sultans, after all, gently implies in and of itself a belief in the legitimacy of their rule, granted that there be no explicit condemnation made elsewhere. The author's choice of terminology lacks any such condemnation. While the author usually uses the Arabic word sultan for the Ottoman rulers, he sometimes also uses the legitimizing Greek term basileos, or emperor, the same word that he uses for the Byzantine rulers. Moreover, he describes Ottoman succession to the throne as, quote, assumption of hereditary rule, or basileia. Dukas, as we have shown, used this same term to legitimize the Paleologi at the expense of the Ottomans through Thucydidean contrast between rulers who owe their power to prerogative and tyrants who owe it to usurpation. Here, however, the anonymous chronicler uses the legitimizing term for the Ottomans and implies that they rule within the confines of law, tradition, and custom. Not only did the anonymous author lack a general anti-Ottoman bias, he considers some of the Ottoman sultans to have been men of good character, worthy of all commendation. This is evident from the ends of his biographies, where he offers honest character assessments of sultans. For example, of Sultan Bayezid II, he writes, "Sultan Bayezid loved amity more than war. He was a modest man. He loved philosophy, and he loved reading the deeds of past emperors. He was, by nature, a good man." Despite his clear endorsal of the legitimacy of Ottoman rule, the anonymous author of the Chronicle of Turkish Sultans offers no intellectual argument explaining why he regards them as legitimate. It is noteworthy that he lived, I think, in the 17th century. For this author, Ottoman rule of former Byzantine territory was a fact of life from birth until death. It seems that he had incorporated assumptions about strong Ottoman rule into his worldview and accepted the Ottomans out of, quote, habit, we can say, without feeling any need to justify himself. Finally, I come to the last group of authors, those who offer legitimizing discourses in support of Ottoman rule. Those four authors can be divided into two subgroups. Late 15th century Byzantine elites, who developed arguments in support of the Ottomans targeted at their well-educated peers, and churchmen of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, who developed arguments aimed at a more popular Greek-speaking Christian audience. And let me point out here that the language of the two groups is fundamentally different in Greek. That is to say that most Greeks of the period, most Greek people living today, could not read what the first group wrote because of the high level of language, whereas the second group is writing in a much more demotic, lower range. The two authors of the first group from my sample are Critophilos and Chalcondyles, both from the 15th century. Critophilos, author of the History of Mehmed the Conqueror, was a Greek scholar in the retinue and service of Mehmed II from the island of Imbros. Mehmed II appointed him governor of Imbros in 1456, and Critophilos submitted his history to the Sultan's court in 1467. Critophilos begins his biography of Mehmed II with an introductory section that it borrows extensively from the Proemium of Herodotus' history in its form, vocabulary, and ideas. Later in the work, Critophilos also extensively mimics Thucydides and Arrian, and presents Mehmed II as if he were a great classical statesman or general, like Pericles, Brasidas, or Alexander. He even depicts Mehmed II as a classical philosopher in some segments. Such presentation prompted cognitive dissonance within Critophilos himself, however, as he did not actually regard Mehmed II as a Greek with connection to the classical past. Thus, in the next section of his work, Critophilos admits and grapples with the novelty and contradiction of writing Greek literature in praise of the Muslim conqueror of Constantinople. After describing his reasons for writing, Critophilos offers an entreaty which contains his attempt to justify the imperial power of the Ottoman Sultanate. There he defends himself against anticipated criticism of his documentation of the fall of the Byzantine Empire and his own people. He provides the following defense, and I quote, "For who has not known that from the time of man's genesis, the attributes of kingship or lordship has not remained upon the same people and not been confined to one people or race? Just like the planets, it has wandered and settled everywhere, both shifting always from race to race and from place to place, at some times to the Assyrians, Medes, and Persians, at others to the Greeks and Romans. It settles itself in accordance with time and period and never comes to the same place. And so it is not something marvelous that the same things as these are done and experienced now, and the Romans lose their fortune and rule." Critophilos then goes on to explain how the Jewish historian Josephus criticized his own people's folly and praised the valor of the Romans when they took Jerusalem and repressed the Jewish revolt of the 1st century CE. Critophilos claims that just as the Romans' valor and skill justified them and earned them fortune's favor, the Ottomans also earned victory through merit. It is therefore not treason to praise the great deeds of the Ottomans and to criticize Byzantine folly, as virtue is always worthy of praise. Critophilos quotes Josephus to bolster his claim that the Ottomans earned the right to rule through merit, adding a link in a literary chain that stretches even farther back to Polybius. Polybius had been the client of Publius Scipio in the 2nd century BC, and he had been sent to Rome after the capture of his native Arcadia, especially you'll notice when Polybius starts talking about his patron. In him we find the first of a series of Greek literary toadies, followed later by Josephus and Critophilos, who use this concept of fortune to explain to their communities that their sons have been killed, their sisters have been enslaved, and their cities have been ravaged, because fortune blesses their valorous opponents, while it punishes their own corruption. Thus, Critophilos consciously places his work within an ancient Greek historical tradition, and he borrows from that tradition to justify the sovereignty of the Ottoman Sultanate. Just as fortune shined upon the Romans and the Byzantines because of their merit and valor, it also has come to reward the Ottomans with hegemony. Chalcondyles, an Athenian historian who wrote a long chronicle focused solely on Ottoman history in the late 15th century, it's unknown, but they think it was finished around 1490, offers basically the same argument. To him also, legitimate kingship moved from empire to empire, people to people, and never rested in the same hands. Neither Chrysostomos nor Chalcondyles made any differentiation between polytheists or Christian empires, considering all to rule with equal legitimacy at their own preordained moments. Both authors were well-educated elites who lived at the end of the 15th century. They had the intellectual ammunition to react to changing conditions thanks to their classical educations and, if you'll forgive the term, its secular nature. Their arguments, however, were clearly aimed at other educated elite Byzantines, like themselves, and would find less appeal among the pious Orthodox Christian masses, among whom even the literate would probably not be able to read their work. An alternative legitimizing discourse for the Ottomans, which aimed at a broader section of the Ottoman Christian population, would, however, develop in the upcoming century. The second group of authors who articulated legitimizing discourses for the Ottoman Sultanate are the author of the Patriarchal History of Constantinople, which I have translated, by the way, and the priest Papasinadinos, author of the Chronicle of Ceres. The Patriarchal History of Constantinople is the work of an unidentified 16th century churchman associated with the Ecumenical Patriarchate here in Istanbul, Constantinople. It is the only extant text from the period that focuses solely on ecclesiastical history, as opposed to late Byzantine or Ottoman history. And although it makes frequent mention of Ottoman sultans and pashas, they're incidental to internal dynamics of the church. The Patriarchal History's author makes his belief in the legitimacy of Ottoman rule quite clear through his descriptions of sultans and his use of terminology. With regards to terminology, the author consistently uses either the term Basileos or Sultanos to refer to the Ottoman sultans. He also strongly implies that he considers the Ottomans to have become legitimate heirs of Byzantine rule after the capture of Constantinople through the manner in which he lists sultans. After the death of Bayezid II, for example, he wrote that he had been the second emperor, and after the death of Sultan Selim, he describes him as having been the third emperor, and so on. This language implies that Mehmed II initiated a line of emperors who lawfully replaced their Byzantine predecessors, like a new dynasty. The Patriarchal History's author never criticizes any Ottoman sultan. Rather, he offers numerous anecdotes depicting the Ottoman sultan as an unbiased arbiter and patron of Christians. He even describes Mehmed II as having perhaps been a Christian at heart, wooed to the faith by the first patriarch, Gennadius. To him, the sultan was legitimate because he was just, whereas in Chrysostomos and Chalcondyles, merit was the key term. Here it's justice. For example, regarding Sultan Murat III, who was reigning at the time of the chronicle's composition, he writes, "When he sat upon the royal throne, he performed, and he still performs every day, acts of great justice. He does not look upon the face of men," meaning that he's unbiased, Greek deum. He only makes just rulings. The term for justice used here, dikaiosini, has deep historical resonance. It appears throughout the Greek Testament, classical literature, and patristic Greek literature, and was also ubiquitous in Byzantine court oratory. Moreover, the Ottomans considered the Sultan's, quote, fundamental duty, to borrow Halil Alcic's phrase, to distribute justice, or adalet, in the Divan Humayun, or imperial council. Thus, by depicting the Ottoman Sultan as a just arbiter, both in and outside of the Divan, the author of the Patriarchal Chronicle utilizes an image that had both classical and Christian resonances, and which was also a central component of Ottoman propaganda and Ottoman intellectuals' own self-state understanding. The Patriarchal Chronicle's author's decision to emphasize this line of argument for legitimizing the Ottoman Sultanate must certainly have been influenced by the Ottoman intellectual context. In a recent article entitled "The Ottoman State and its Orthodox Christian Subjects, the Legitimizing Discourse in the 17th Century Chronicle of Ceres," Olga Todorova argues that this text also offers a legitimizing discourse for Ottoman rule through its depiction of the Sultan as a just arbiter and distributor of justice in the imperial divan. The nature of these chronicles is very different, but the consistent positive image of the Sultan as the patron of Christians and as a distributor of justice links them. In sum, this paper has shown that early modern Greek chronicle writers articulated a very wide diversity of views on the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultanate, which could perhaps even be called vigorous debate, although there's no reference going on between authors. Contrary to predictions in the academic literature, most authors did not convey a belief that the legitimacy of the Ottoman Sultanate was born out of fatalism. Rather, authors were polarized between those who denied the legitimacy of the Ottoman state and those who offered legitimizing theories in its defense. Two of the latter were influenced not only by classical and Near Eastern tradition, but also, it seems, by Ottoman political theory and propaganda, implying intellectual interaction between Muslims and Christian subjects. In subsequent work, I'd like to explore this interaction further. For now, however, I eagerly await your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we're going to move on to the second paper and have the Q&A afterwards. I mean, if you don't mind. I mean, yeah.
Whatever you think.
Our EU enlargement policies, I try to, on the one side, to talk about basic concepts very briefly in the beginning, and then become more special for my case in this paper that is about Croatia and Macedonia. So if you have any questions, maybe we can clear them later in the Q&A session. I will start with a short introduction about the basic concepts, the rule of law and EU enlargement policy. In the 1980s, the European Union has become more interested into the rule of law and the democracy in its own member states and in candidate countries. This began with the candidacy of Greece, Spain and Portugal in the 80s, which had been non-democratic states before, then with the intention of former communist countries in the east and southeast of Europe to become members of the European Union, and finally with the introduction of the rule of law and democracy as principles of the European Union in the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. So the effect of this debate for enlargement policies were the Copenhagen criteria in 1993. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. In 1993, the European Union stipulated that membership requires that the candidate country has achieved stability of institutions, guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and respect for and protection of minorities. So since that time, for entering an accession process, a candidate country must prove its adherence to these principles. And for an eventual accession, candidates have to comply with a catalogue of demands, which are regularly reviewed by the European Commission in the progress reports. And for complying with these demands, they receive assistance and technical and financial assistance. And at the same time, they are subjected to pressure from the European Union institutions, other governments, and also from within their own population. Later on, these principles are also included in the primary law of the European Union. Article 49 of the Treaty on the European Union says that the EU expects from candidate countries that they respect the values of the European Union in Article 2 of the Treaty, and that they are committed to promoting them to become, they have to do this to become a member of the European Union. And these values of the European Union, again, are the respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. To identify the ability of candidate countries to meet with these expectations, the European Union applies the principle of conditionality. Conditionality itself is not a part of the primary law of the European Union, but it comes from the spirit of the treaties. And since 1998, it is also enforceable de facto, because in that year the European Union issued a regulation that makes the allocation of financial assistance to candidate countries dependent on their compliance with the enlargement criteria. So what is conditionality itself? It is a reinforcement by reward, by definition of Schimmelpfennig. It just means that in return for compliance with expectations, the candidate countries will receive assistance and an upgrade of their institutional ties to the European Union. That can be a trade agreement first, then later association agreements, and eventually the full membership in the Union. In return, if they do not comply, the European Union has its own ways to react to this by denying certain rewards, and in the worst case by suspending existing agreements. But I have to say this has never happened in reality so far. So this is the basis of my work. What I did was to ask myself under which conditions the EU's assistance and pressure on candidate countries is the most effective. This has been a subject to many authors in the field of Europeanization. So what I did was I picked two current candidate countries Macedonia and Croatia. I picked them because they have various similarities that allow for a comparison of the factors. They are located in the same region. They both belong to the former Yugoslavia. They both had considerable domestic difficulties in the 90s. There was a war in Croatia and later there was a civil war in Macedonia. And they are both the only candidate countries in their region of the Western Balkans. So, and despite these similarities, they were both under EU influence during the 90s and 2000s. They followed very different development paths. They are both on different stages of the enlargement process. Croatia is close to an accession, whereas Macedonia is known to be still this far from it. They have to comply with many more demands of the European Union. So they are similar and still different. This is why I selected them. And to summarize before I go into the details, my argument is that the EU conditionality has been one of the driving factors for improvements in two areas in these countries. I picked respect for minority rights and corruption, because they were both very relevant for these countries, and they both belong to the core principles of the European Union. That means that they matter a lot for the European Union, because before they let them access the European Union. But the EU has not been the main source of improvement. It has been important, but not the main source. Secondly, I found when I looked into the details that the EU cannot, as it seems, use the instruments that it developed for itself to the fullest potential. I will go into details later. And lastly, I found support for the argument made in the literature that effective conditionality absolutely needs favorable domestic conditions, especially political competitiveness at the national level. I will explain that also later. So first I will give you an overview about the variables that I used for my work. First of all, I used the argument by Mevhibe Ateş from 2005. She says that for having successful conditionality on the domestic level, there must be political competitiveness. That means there must be the possibility for a political turnover through elections. And this is especially important after the breakdown of an old regime, such as the communist countries in the east of Europe or the former Yugoslavian countries. Because after the breakdown, the new rulers after the breakdown have the possibility to write the new rules. And if they introduce political competitiveness, they will provide for bigger opportunities later for the countries. Through political competitiveness, for example, the cost for political rent-seeking grow because the voters will be better informed by an opposition and by other major forces which are also powerful about the possibilities that they have, and the room of maneuver of ruling politicians will decrease to rule only in their own, to their own advantage. Secondly, we need a strong pro-democratic liberal opposition at the beginning, because then the probability that liberal rules will be written is higher. And secondly, after the breakdown of the regime and the establishment of a new regime, we need the old communist rulers, in the case of Mevhibe, and in my own case also, to transform, to develop into a real alternative to the new elite, so that political competitiveness can be upheld. Mevhibe in our book also shows that in countries where pro-liberal forces were not strong enough to take over the power after the regime breakdown, these countries complied much more hesitant with EU rules, and they tended to only introduce partial reforms, so that in the end the democratization and the full respect for the rule of law would take a longer time. Secondly, I used the work of Kochenov from 2008 because it was very useful for my method that I applied. He says that the European Union has different instruments at its disposal to put pressure on the candidate countries, and he delivers a hierarchy of these instruments. He says that if political leaders at the highest level articulate the absolute need to change something, this will be the highest incentive for domestic governments to change the deficiencies on the ground. Secondly, it's a less strong tool of the European Union if they address the problematic issue in all documents, such as the progress reports, accession partnerships, and all documents. This will put considerable pressure on the national government. Then we have the possibility to address it regularly in the progress reports and in the short-term priorities of the accession partnership. Then there are the mid-term or non-prioritized areas of the accession partnership. Then there's a possibility to announce demands only in the progress reports. And lastly, that happens in some other areas, they only take up this issue from time to time, but not regularly in the progress reports. And lastly, I used Jim and Fanning's work with his colleagues. They claim that material benefits are of biggest importance for compliance, and that makes sense, of course. If you offer money to a candidate country, you may be more likely to answer your demands. Secondly, he also links it to the party system on the ground. He differentiates between liberal, mixed, and illiberal party systems. And they vary according to the strength of reform-minded parties in the political system. So, of course, in a liberal system, compliance is more likely than in an anti-liberal system. And in mixed systems, this is maybe the most interesting case, we have some parties which are reform-minded and others who are more illiberal, but due to the EU influence claims, there is a subtle shift of balances in the institutional setup and in the informational environment. So on the long run, the liberal forces will gain advantage over the illiberal ones. But in the end, they will comply with a considerable delay. So what I use, I looked into the partnership documents. I could have also used other things, but my time and scope for my paper was of course limited. So I focused on them. Then I used an analysis of the progress reports prepared by another organization. Then I looked into the material benefits and the characters of the first governments of Croatia and Macedonia after their independence from Yugoslavia. And then I looked into the time and frequencies of political turnovers, the orientation of the main parties. And as I said, I used some secondary sources to arrange all this information, especially from the World Bank, Minority Rights Group International, and Transparency International. And on the other side, what I did myself was an analysis of the partnership documents. So now I will look into the minority rights first, as the first area of concern of the European Union. There is an analysis of the Minority Rights Group International of 2008. And this group, this group conducted an analysis and compared the content of the progress reports of the European Union with the observations of other established organizations on the ground, such as the OECD and the Council of Europe. And they found that both for Croatia and Macedonia, these reports lacked completeness and qualitative assessments. The list of deficiencies on the ground was long, and these deficiencies were not addressed adequately in the progress reports. I have to say that in the case of Croatia, this list was long, but for Macedonia, the list of deficiencies which were ignored by the progress reports was even longer. And then I looked myself into the partnership documents, and I found that in the case of Croatia, these partnership documents around the year 2004 started with few demands. And over the years, demands became more and more, and the old ones were upheld in these progress reports. I was surprised when I saw this, because Croatia, as we know, is closer to an accession, so I expected to be the number of demands to decrease instead of increase, because we should expect compliance with new demands. Okay. Secondly, for Macedonia, I found the reverse pattern. Once raised demands were dropped at a later point, so I could take this as a sign of improvement. So in the end, I was not sure about my observation in Croatia, and I think there have been some arguments in the literature that the progress overall towards EU accession and the concrete monitoring of the European Union may not be coupled as tightly as we should expect it. Then I looked into the material benefits, and again I used the report of the Minority Rights Group International, and it criticizes both the financial aid given to Croatia and to Macedonia. We must know that Croatia was, the size of financial help under the FAIR program, for example, was very limited. Thirdly, the MRGI finds it, and also I found it for my old master's thesis in the case of Turkey, that groups on the ground were not integrated into the planning processes and into the implementation processes of the program. So we can expect that the programs were not as good designed for the specific problems as they could have been. And lastly, the grants which were awarded were too big for many civil society organizations on the ground. And secondly, there were linguistic barriers for small organizations which may do good work on the ground, but which are not fluent in French or English. This criticism is for both countries alike. Then I will look into corruption. What you see here is the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. I have to say, for the red line, which is Macedonia, between 2000 and 2002, Macedonia was not included in this index. This is why the line drops down to 0. Generally, a higher rate means an improvement in terms of corruption. I used also another index which displayed a similar development of the World Bank. And what we see is that Croatia, for example, started in 1999 with a corruption perception index of 2.7. Now it is at 4.1. It is the best value for Croatia so far, but it is still below most of the EU scores of EU member states. And it is only a relatively small improvement on a scale from 0 to 10. It's a larger scale. When we look into the partnership documents, we see that Croatia was confronted with 13 demands in total, and again, these were upheld in later documents, so the number of demands was growing over time, which again contradicts Croatia's progress towards EU accession. And on the other side, for Macedonia, the pattern was again reversed. In the beginning there were more demands, and only 8 remain nowadays. 6 demands are still in the short-term priorities, and 2 are in the long-term priority section. So again, we might say that the documents or the instruments of the European Union make some sense when we look to Macedonia, but in the case of Croatia, we wonder why Croatia progresses if these documents, at least in the area of corruption, show a reverse pattern. And then for the material benefits, there is a line under the instrument for pre-accession assistance, EPI, that also covers measures in the fight against corruption. But I think a complete assessment of this instrument would need a closer look into the concrete processes on the ground. But what I can say is that an improvement would be displayed by these perception indexes, and then we can say that again the material benefits in the case of Macedonia are more likely to be effective than in the case of Croatia. So lastly, I have to hurry up a little bit, but this is the most crucial variable, political competitiveness. I mean, in Croatia, we have 2 main parties. The one is the ADZ, is the anti-communist and nationalist Croatian Democratic Union, and then there is a Social Democrat Party, which emerged from the former Communist Party. For most of the 90s, Croatia was dominated by the Croatian Democratic Union under Tudjman. The change from Yugoslavian rule to independence was peaceful internally, but under the external threat in the confrontation with Serbia. So there was no time, as the authors argue, for a consolidation of the pro-democratic movement. Pusic, for example, says that some of the nationalists who leaded the ADZ had been persecuted by the communist regime, but that experience did not make them into Democrats. So the new ruling elite after independence of Croatia did not support liberal ideals. And under the ADZ domination, political liberalization stayed absent for a long time. Then lastly, I looked into the political turnovers, and I saw that the first governmental change was in 2000 after the death of Tudjman. And since that time, coalition governments changed more frequently. So I found support for Vakudava's argument. I mean, Croatia did not comply with EU demands for most of the 1990s under the Tudjman rule, but after a change had taken place on the ground, Croatia started to comply. So, and effectiveness grew. Then secondly, I look into the case of Macedonia. We have, again, two major parties, the former Communist Party, SDSM, and then a nationalist party. In the case of Macedonia, the old communist rulers stayed in power after independence from Yugoslavia, again under the impression of a danger from abroad, under the threat of a conflict with the Serbs, which in the end did not happen that much. In the case of Macedonia, governmental coalitions began to change earlier than in Croatia. I mean, already in 1996 there was a change in the coalition, and the major governmental party changed for the first time in 1998. Again, this observation validates somehow Bakudov's argument that Macedonia, which complied earlier, was also the country which had the earlier political competitiveness compared to Croatia. So to summarize my findings once again, especially in the case of Croatia, I wonder if the European Union uses its instruments to their fullest potential, because there is a difference between the overall development and what we see in the partnership documents. In the case of Macedonia, EU instruments are used more consistently at least. But Macedonia lags behind Croatia. I mean, there are many reasons. I didn't go into too many details now. I mean, Croatia had a conflict in the 90s, whereas Macedonia had a kind of civil war in the early 2000s, which threw the country back on its path to accession. And also credibility may play a role. Maybe Croatians perceive the European Union's rewards as more credible than the Macedonians. We can discuss that. But for both countries, I found arguments that support Bakudov's and Schimmelpfennig's arguments on domestic circumstances. And still we should ask ourselves how closely these EU instruments are coupled with the accession process. So, thank you.
We'll have time with the quick Q&A session. We can just talk about more.
First of all, I'd like to repeat, like my colleagues have done, thanks for organizing this competition, first of all, and Ms. Mevhibe Ateş for the great opportunity with the competition. And my paper was about regional and domestic legitimacy of comprehensive military occupations, a comparative case study of occupations of Japan 1945 and 1952 and Iraq 2003 and 2010. Actually, it's going on still, but as the period of observation, I take 2010 as the end point, although it's still going on and there remains some American forces still in Iraq. First of all, legitimacy in international relations. It's not directly related to the rule of law, but rule of law is within legitimacy. So I take the concept in international relations, but still it will, as I go on, as I proceed, it will relate to the rule of law as well. And legitimacy in international relations, it has been studied in political science widely, mostly taken as the rule of law, but in international relations it has begun, especially after the invasion of Iraq. When I looked at the literature about legitimacy, after the invasion of Iraq, it was a lot about the analogy between the invasion of Japan and Iraq, and then the English school theorists began talking about legitimacy, and constructivists took the legitimacy and associated it with the rule of law. If you look at the literature, the starting point for legitimacy, for discussing that concept in international relations, is the invasion of Iraq. And three positions I have seen have emerged after the discussions began. First of all, legitimacy as legality in terms of its compliance, in terms of the compliance of the action, the military occupation with international law. Is it sanctioned by international law? Has it been initiated by compliance with the United Nations Security Council, international law, and so on? And the second position was by rationalists. I'll explain more about it because I hesitate to say by realists, so I prefer by rationalists. Legitimacy, they said, tracks material interests. And by material interests, realists, I mean, the major proponent was a realist, by the way. And by material, they meant economic interests and security interests. But as I said, I hesitate to say realist because not all of them agree with that position. So I rather prefer going with rational's account. And third one was about just war theory lines. Richard Falk, the major proponent of the view, and Michael Walzer, of course, he discussed that. Legitimacy, they said, is not about compliance with international law, or it doesn't track material interests, but it's mostly about just war, how the war is fought, its reasons, how it began, so its justification. They said it's also about like justice and so on and so forth. And comprehensive occupations, if I want to clarify, I take that term from David Edelstein, who also is the rationalist, the major rationalist proponent of the second position. And he takes that from another guy who distinguished between occupations, different types of occupations, and he came up with 18 different types. But I take comprehensive occupations because the Japan and Iraq are comprehensive occupations, by which I mean that the occupying power does not only militarily occupy the country, but they also come up with an economic and political liberalization program. So they want to transform the country along democratic and political liberal political lines, and as such, it's different from security occupations in which you don't have any political or economic program for the occupied country, and it's also different from comprehensive occupation, different types of occupations. So when I say comprehensive military occupations, I mean like in Japan, like happened in Japan, like happened in Iraq, the occupying power comes up with economic and political modernization program. And as I said, it's all the case selection. I chose the case Japan and Iraq. I was mostly fascinated with the analogy everyone made during after the invasion of Iraq happened with the case of Japan. They all said they all compared it, and without any systematic study, without looking into further variables. And again, if I go back, as I say, regional and domestic legitimacy, I'm not interested in international legitimacy. I'm not interested in how European peoples or states saw the cases, like Iraq, or how the North American people saw it. I'm interested in the regional and domestic legitimacy. By domestic, I mean the occupied country, how the people in the occupied country see or perceive the legitimacy of the occupation. As such, for the Iraqi case, I take particular countries, Turkey and Iraq, and of course the Middle East is a region. And for the case of Japan, I take China, Philippines, Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Bengal. I don't go into details of the countries, but in terms of how Japan, for example, how Japan is devastating attacks on these countries when it was following an expansionist foreign policy, I take those countries and I look at how they were negatively impacted. The periods observed, as I said, for Japan 1945, 1952, and for Iraq 2003 and 2010. As I said, not interested in international legitimacy, but domestic and regional. Legitimacy is an abstract concept. It's all about perceptions, how people perceive an act, a military occupation. So as an abstract concept, it's the basic problem that confronts a researcher is how to measure. How do we measure people's perceptions? How do I say people perceive it illegitimately? To what I rely on? First of all, and there are three indicators for me for perception for measuring legitimacy, the concept of legitimacy. First of all, insurgency. Was there an insurgency? Did an insurgency develop in that country, in the occupied country, or its absence? Anti-Americanism for the Middle East, it has been rising for the last years, and I argue, can I take it as a measure or not in the next slides? And also opinion polls, and there has been consistent opinion polls by prestigious organizations such as Pew or Gallup polls and so on in the Middle East, and they ask people their opinions. Do they perceive legitimate or illegitimate? So, and also people's views of suicide attacks. If people support suicide bombings against the occupying country, then I take that as an indicator of people's views of the legitimacy of the occupation. I discussed anti-Americanism and levels of analysis. For the Middle East, it's necessary to take the levels of analysis because you cannot just say Iraqi people perceived legitimately or illegitimately because there is not a monolith Iraqi people. Kurds, as I'm going to talk about, Kurds proceeded legitimately, but on the other hand, the Sunni and the Shiites, they proceeded legitimately. So you need to go into the subnational level in Iraq when you talk about it. And that's the lack of overlap between the nation and the state has been well argued in the literature. Telhami and Barnett in their book, they argued, Fred Holiday, late Fred Holiday, and he had argued, Bernard Lewis had argued about it. So you need to take levels of analysis when you talk about Iraq especially. The concept of legitimacy, what has been the definitions? I mean, there has been multiple definitions, but I took several, I mean, some here. Ian Hurt, for example, of Northwestern University, he argued that legitimacy is an actor's normative belief that the rule of institution ought to be obeyed. Wolford and Brooks, they said a set of beliefs about propriety, acceptability, or neutralness of an action, an actor's role, or a political order. And finally, Krotosh will go and went into a distinction between input legitimacy and output legitimacy. Input legitimacy being, does the action conform to legal procedures? Legal procedures envisaged for taking that action, for making that decision. And output legitimacy is the outcomes of the action, outcomes of the action. Did it bring the intended results or the beneficial results? But I mean, there's a lot of discussion and confusing discussion about legitimacy. But I really like, I thought it wasn't that much complicated to define legitimacy. People define legitimacy, if people see an action legitimate, they mostly mean it will be viewed by them, by politicians and ordinary people, as righteous, proper, justifiable. That's the basic definition I go with. And if I begin with the positions, as I said, 3 positions have emerged in the rationalist hypothesis of legitimacy of military occupations. David Edelstein, for example, in 2010, I think, and before in 2004, he said legitimacy tracks material interests. Basically, if an action makes actor A wealthy and secure, then that actor will leave it as legitimate. If not, then it's not seen legitimate. It's seen as illegitimate. In application for Iraq, he maintained, had the US invasion and occupation of Iraq immediately improved the welfare and security of the people of Iraq and its neighbors, as it tragically did not, then I suspect it would have been accorded more legitimacy. So basically, he said legitimacy tracks material interests. Then before I go into, and there is the Telhami and Zogby International. They're carrying out that poll consistently. And in 2008, 2009, for example, they saw with Egypt and without Egypt. For 2009, for example, 78% of people say it's all about the policy, American policy, not about values. And again, 2008, similar 8%, and without Egypt, 87% and 81%. So people in general, and there is also literature about that, not only these polls, but people argue to a large extent, America is not viewed legitimately, the invasion and the American presence, mostly in the Middle East, because what America does, not what America is. And Turkey, for example, suicide attacks, and in the region too, do people agree with attacking the American forces? Do they view it justifiable? Turkey, for example, we have a different kind of understanding in Islam and suicide attacks. In general, when you ask them, Turkish people, 76% say suicide attacks are not justifiable. But when you ask it in the context of the American invasion of Iraq, then the percentage decreases to 59%. That's a major decrease. But the percentage of people seeing it positively, 35%, which is, I think, a big number for Turkey. Turkish people, for example, again, they were happy with the government's decision not to support the invasion, 72%. Another Pew 2004 poll found out again, no, that's not really about that, but another poll, again, I think in 2004, found out the Turkish people, 83% of Turkish people supported the government's decision not to support the invasion. But so if people in the region, if they viewed it legitimately, the occupation, was that because, as rational hypothesis would hold, was that because they lost more than they gained from the occupation? Did they lose more economically and security-wise than they gained from it? And I look at Turkey and Iran for that. If we look at, for example, Turkey's political and security outcomes, you see negative, there was great fear that there will be a Kurdish state independent in northern Iraq. They have, Turks were afraid that there were ties, they had their brethren in Kirkuk and Erbil and Mosul, they would be disadvantaged. Economic outcomes, the initial cost of the invasion, the oil coming to Ceyhan was stopped. I mean, that stopped. And then later occupation, the economic interaction between Iraq and Turkey, that came to a halt almost. So those were the negative outcomes. But we have positive outcomes too by the time. For example, you see now recently high-level strategic cooperation council, and open the borders, increasing tourism and trade too. So we have, if you look at the economic side too, we have the positive effects too. So we have a mixed record of economic and security benefits and damages and losses. And Iran too, we have the same thing. So if people, I mean, I'm not going to go into detail again, I have more stuff to tell. So if the record is mixed in terms of economic and political gains and losses, so why do people view the invasion illegitimately? I mean, then obviously it's not all about rationalist hypothesis. It's not only about people's views of legitimacy of the war. It's not only about did they gain materially from it, or did they lose materially and economic-wise and security-wise from it. So then I look at what else might have impacted the result and how the war is fought. That's a great change from Japan to Iraq, for example. When you ask the Iraqis, they say, for example, how have the US forces in Iraq conducted themselves? They say total, only 34% said the Americans were careful to treat people justly and how they conducted themselves. And in Baghdad, it drops to 10%, basically. And if you ask the people in the region, then US effort to avoid civilian casualties, in Turkey it's only 9%. If you go to Jordan, only 3%. Palestinians, for example, maybe, and you can object, you cannot be taken really. But Lebanon is 23%, so people in the region too, they said America is not being careful to avoid civilian casualties. And that's a great, I think, impact too. Because in Japan, although, despite the previous prejudices between peoples, the Americans conducted themselves really well on the ground. That made a great impact. That kind of erased, even John Dauber, I think, would argue, he argues, that erased the previous prejudices, because the Japanese saw on the ground that the Americans were not really what they thought they were. And in the Middle East, I think also, how about the perception of American policy towards the Middle East Muslims and Arabs for some decades? How is that perception, that negative perception impact the views of the American occupation? For example, Michael Shore, I think, he argues, he brings in Israel too, and he says, for example, thanks for the dental work. That Iraqis, he thinks they, fun way. Thanks for dental work, but why did you stand by and watch Israel got Lebanon in the summer of 2006? So, other countries, the support of American support for other countries like Israel, that also comes into impact too, when people view the occupation legitimately or not. And oil is it again a curse? And this time it seems to be, because people believe about American motives. They believe that the reason for the occupation wasn't about bringing democracy, but it was about controlling the Middle East, dominating the world, and so on. And if you see the people, like Turkey, 64%, Morocco, Jordan, for example, 71%. So people saw, oil complicates the issues as well. So you need to pay attention if the country, the occupied country, has oil or not. Or they have a massive natural resource, it doesn't have to be oil all the time. And the interesting thing is about the legal aspect, the international law, compliance with international law. The people in the region, they are not really concerned about its compliance with international law. For example, in Turkey it says, 45% of people, they say only UN blessing is important, but not really, not unlike Europe, for example, in Britain or Germany. So you see, it seems to be more about how the war is fought on the ground, how the occupying force treats the occupied population, but not totally, not absolutely about the UN approval. So the conclusions, what needs to be paid attention. So it's not like straightforward as the rationalist hypothesis would hold it. It's not only about material gains, but also you need to look at, does the occupied country have natural resources? Taking UN mandate is not absolutely necessary. Was not there in Japan, was not there in the Middle East, but that's not all about it. And how homogeneous the occupied society is. Japan is homogeneous, but Iraq, Kurds and Sunni, the Shiites, that's a great deal. Security and bringing security to the people during the occupation, I mean, like lack of insurgencies, lack of civilian deaths, that's important, ideal. But even if, for example, that cannot be controlled because, for example, Al-Qaeda came into Iraq from outside to create that insurgency, even if that happens, civilian death must be, it seems, avoided. The war must be, the occupying forces must conduct themselves justly on the ground. And whether there is a former aggression, imperialism by the occupied country, and in that case, Japan had it, and Iraq, their aggression against Kuwait, for example, it was there too. But how did it impact how did it complicate the other issues? That's also need to be paid attention. And lastly, the perception, remembrance of former policies of the occupying forces, and then, as I said, including its support for another country, Israel. How that perception also complicates the views of legitimacy. So legitimacy as a concept is not, it seems complicated in an occupation, in military occupation. There are other factors, other variables that came in and that need to be considered. And my study is not, of course, intended to bring any generalization because it's only, first of all, based on 2 cases. But bringing those factors, what might impact the views of legitimacy, you need to then conduct further research by bringing in countries with, for example, similar natural resource existence to see to what extent those factors play a role. And that's I think all I want to say about that.
Okay, thank you. Idea of legitimacy maybe in international relations. But you talk about 3 different, contexts in which the question of legitimacy can be raised. One is a domestic context, the other one is the possible regional context. And then shortly here, towards the end, you talk about also the international context. You don't pay that much attention to it. You also say that, the UN mandate is not necessary, because, you said, in Japan, it didn't even come into the picture. But I guess, before the Second World War, I guess, League of Nations was there, but but ultimately, if you were to develop a global theory of legitimacy in international relations, how do you think all of these 3 levels would interact with each other? Ultimately, the kind of theory of legitimacy you would develop in international relations that would work in a meaningful way to understand, you think that, international level, regional level, and the domestic level will all have to line up with each other, or they don't matter, it doesn't matter? Or, because it looks like they wouldn't actually matter that much, because, the fact that Turks see the US occupation as legitimate may not really matter to Iraqis that much, or the Japanese that much. What if all these levels go against each other rather than together?
Well, I think that's, first of all, we need to see, if that's going to happen. First of all, more case studies needed, for sure. And there's no study, there's no, for example, study on taking many cases. So that's the first step. For example, more cases need to be taken, and then we need to see, actually, do they come into clash, or do they really matter to each other or not? For now, I think there is no study done, and that needs to be seen, that remains to be seen. Would they clash, on the regional level, domestic level, international level? Would they clash, the views? Would they matter to each other? And that needs to be seen too. I have really, since there's no study, and my study, that research doesn't really, it's not concerned, it's intended to be...
But speaking intuitively, for example, would an Iraqi care about how a Turk thinks, about,
Probably not. No. Probably not. Probably not. My intuition is probably, not.
Right.
As the occupied people. But as I said, would they come to clash? That needs to be seen, just like I'm saying, from intuition.
I have a question for Gita. Please feel free to join. Now, as I was watching your presentation, I just made a very simple line of causation in my head. Rule of law, legitimacy, comes from credibility of justice. Now, in the Macedonian case, you briefly mentioned, I don't know if that was the point that you were going to, but you said as as a side point, there is some credibility issues with respect to EU reforms. And in Macedonia, what I think is Greece. Maybe the Macedonian government may look at Greece as a, and this kind of goes into a little realistic thought, but maybe the Macedonian government thinks that the EU reforms are just a Trojan horse for the Greek ambitions of their own country, or whatnot. Now, of course, and it's easy to build conspiracy theories and whatnot, but I was just trying to merge that with this rule of law theme, and whether the credibility and therefore the legitimacy of such reforms towards pushing a country in the rule of law may suffer from some exogenous factors, and maybe besides pushing EU reforms to their fullest extent, maybe another policy implication could be to convince or somehow, make sure that such credibility concerns are addressed in the places where you're trying to promote the rule of law. Because if you look at Macedonian politics, I know very little, I'm sure you know infinitely more than I do, but this Greekophobia, so to speak, is an important issue. So I was wondering how that would play into your argument for rule of law.
I think you're right about this. I mean, I mentioned credibility as a last point because I just wanted to indicate there are much more factors to take into account. I could only look into these two things, like instruments of documents and then the material benefits. But you're right. I think the public opinion about the EU member states and the real chances to get into the European Union and the meaning of becoming a member of the European Union, the implications for domestic policies and sovereignty are very important, but I could not cover them in this paper. I think for that, for example, I should look into media coverage on the issue, for example, and statements of public opinion leaders, for instance. And this must be included into further research, yes. And I think you're right, I agree with you.
Sure.
Again, on your paper, on your presentation, which I liked a lot, and so you talked about using Vakshidova, and I don't know how the pronunciation goes, but the importance of political competitiveness. But rather than political competitiveness or competition in general, I think you talked about convergence versus divergence. With respect to like pro-EU or anti-EU views of the existing political parties. So I'm not sure, because competition would or might mean fragmentation, the level, extent of fragmentation, for instance. When you think of the Turkish case, Turkish political parties, so you think of political fragmentation. But then you rather talked about convergence versus divergence. And you also mentioned liberal parties. And I'm not sure if like the conceptualization of liberal was accurate there. So, and what kind of liberal position did you specifically refer to? So then is that only like being pro-EU, then would mean a liberal party? Economically liberal?
Yeah, simplified it would mean that. I mean, I took these terms from Vakudova, and she tries to describe the orientation of political parties in 6 Eastern and Central Europe.
For the 17th century, Papas Sinodinos, the Chronicle of Ceres, we know him. He wrote in Ceres, he spent most of his life in Ceres. One manuscript exists on Mount Athos.
Okay, and then the question is, I mean, when you compare the 17th century chronicles with the earlier ones, 15th century, for example, the obvious difference in their position vis-a-vis, the legitimacy of the Ottoman rule. An obvious factor is the fact that, it's been some time, the Ottoman regime is well established and everything, and they've had a chance to perhaps acquire some of the notions about, the justice of equity and the circle of equity from the Ottoman discourse as well. So much interaction had taken place by then. Apart from that factor, can we say anything about the background of the authors that may perhaps explain their the differences in their attitude towards the Ottomans?
I've looked into Ottoman. 2 authors are very anti-Ottoman. For the 16th century, let's see, for the 16th century, 1 is pro-Ottoman, 2 are, I'm trying to remember, 2 are anti-Ottoman. For the 17th century, they're both somewhat pro-Ottoman, but in different ways. So I actually think that as time goes on, that there might be, that they might become, become more pro-Ottoman, but there's not enough numbers for me to be able to really say that.
Okay.
In terms of geography, we don't know where a lot of these chronicles were written, so that messes everything up. But then if you really look at the details, so for example, two people who are coming from exactly the same class, like Critopoulos, he's a Byzantine elite on the island of Imbros, and then Doukas, he's an elite Greek on the island of Lesbos. I mean, their opinions are diametrically opposed. 16th century, Makarios Melisenos Melisurgos, a churchman associated with the ecumenical patriarchate, he not only is anti-Ottoman, but he actively goes into revolt against the Ottoman state, and he aids the Habsburg fleet at Lepanto, and then later flees the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the author of the Patriarchal History of Constantinople, exact same class, also a churchman, exact same time, is writing a discourse in support of the Ottomans. I was unable to really create any kind of correlation, except insofar as among the authors who developed legitimizing discourses for the Ottomans, they did cluster into these two groups. The 15th century Byzantine elites who wrote in High Greek and used classical arguments to support the Ottomans, and then later churchmen who were, again, also this, the circle of justice, this concept of the just king. I mean, you see that in Herodotus. It's an ancient thing that is not, something that I would associate with Islam or the Ottomans in and of themselves, but you see that in the late church authors. So, other than these two clusters, I had a hard time finding, there was no patterns.
I have a question related to your last remark, actually.
Sure.
If you were to undertake a project of archaeology of these ideas, I mean, there is the obvious precedents that you have mentioned, right, regarding what I would call maybe a cyclical idea of history, the times pass and the dynasties change and this and that. And also the idea of justice also can be traced back to the Greek precedents as well.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time can be traced back to the Islamic tradition as well.
Right.
And we do know, we briefly talked about this earlier, you may recall. Islamic tradition itself can be traced back to the Greek tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So the links, over time and synchronically that may be, active at simultaneously at the time of the writing of these treatises, how the traditions may have influenced one another, tracing the parallelisms back in time, one axis of inquiry, and the interaction, across the traditions at a given time in history, another axis of inquiry. So, if you were to be given the task of, I know you're interested in these issues.
I'm totally interested in the concept of the archaeology of these ideas is right on.
Right.
I've looked into this, so yeah.
So do you have some ideas about your future work, perhaps like focusing on one author and doing a intellectual biography, through an archaeology of these ideas?
Well, let me just put it this way. I mean, this is just a real short summary of a much bigger thing. And before I could really, do this project, I had to get into studying Byzantine and Ottoman political theory in general, and particularly Byzantine political theory, to try and understand, what are the norms that these authors are coming out of. And what I'm finding is just something, just a huge eclectic collection of arguments. So on the one hand, you have the so-called, Erasmian, theory. You have, the concept of the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, as God's appointee, as the concept of the divine right of kings. But you also have just this whole assortment of images. You have the emperor as as a new King David, as an Alexander. You have this whole series of analogies and literary images, and simultaneously, and the concept of the emperors being just, and a whole eclectic array of images that ebb and flow in their use across Byzantine history. And it's characterized by an eclecticism. In the Ottoman case, it's the same way. You have Neshri, creating genealogies for Oğuzhan. You have, you have the circle of justice. You have Tursun Bey basically articulating a concept of the divine right of kings. And so in both cases, I'm seeing a huge amount of, a huge, and also in the Ottoman case, you still have like classical images. You still have, Ahmedi describing the Ottomans as, as like Alexander, again Tursun Bey like Alexander. Then also, images from Persian literature like Rustam and so on. So I'm seeing in both cases a huge amount of eclectic images with actually with a lot of overlap, with a lot of overlap. And so. So when it comes to the archaeology of this, in the case of the Circle of Justice, I can see how that argument has resonance with these Christian authors, because it's also kind of there in Greek literature and Herodotus, and it's there. So and in Christian literature, so it's resonating. But I really think it is the Ottoman influence that makes that strand dominate over the multiple other strands that are possible. As with regards to the question the way I want to go with this is I'm interested in looking at like later Greek texts and looking for more examples of like an Ottoman Turkish influence on their ideas. And then I'm also like, for example, right now I'm reading Oruç, because Oruç has this passage on the history of the Hagia Sophia and on Byzantine history, and I'm looking at I'm reading Katip Çelebi also has passages on Byzantine history. He was said to have translated from Greek. I don't think that's true. I think he was translating from Latin. I think I haven't found actually anybody attesting that he was translating Greek. But I'm on the one hand I'm looking at for later Greek authors and influenced by and looking for intellectual influence from the Ottoman side, and then I'm also looking at passages on Greek history in Ottoman authors and trying to see if very basic questions are not answered, like were they actually reading Greek? I'm not finding many cases in which I can really think that they're reading Greek. I think they're getting things secondhand, and so I'm basically just at the beginning of trying to understand the depths of the possibility for intellectual communication, and I'm not at the stage of proposing any kind of case study of a single author. I'm at the stage of answering very basic questions. For example, who knows Greek? Who's reading Greek? When they talk about Greek history, Byzantine history, does it mean that they actually have a Greek text in front of them, or does it mean that they've heard secondhand stories that have gotten totally manipulated? And so I'm at that kind of beginning stage, and answering those very basic questions is taking time. So. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question about to Henry as well. I mean, you're looking at now certain primary text chronicles, who write about Ottoman rulers.
Right.
Did you have a chance to also look at, or have you seen, any mention of non-Ottoman, non-Turkish rulers, and how, these same chronicles, talk about Ottoman rulers, talk about other non-Ottoman, non-Turkish rulers? Or perhaps their colleague, if not the same chronicle, not the same text, but for example, how would, somebody of the same stature or same place, maybe a colleague perhaps writing about non-Turkish, non-Ottoman rulers, and how would they compare? Do they use comparable canons of judgment, forms of judgment of them, meritocracy, so on and so forth?
It's very useful. One thing I do is it's very useful when within a single chronicle they oftentimes begin with Byzantine history and then move into Ottoman history, and then you can directly compare the description of Byzantine emperors with the description of Ottoman emperors, and so that's a good litmus test with regards to my main question. Sometimes they'll be exalting the Byzantine emperor, they'll be using different vocabulary for him, and then completely transform in the Ottoman case. But other times they'll be using the same vocabulary. Sometimes it's completely reversed. You have Greek authors like the author of the Chronicle of Turkish Sultans, the 17th century one, who loathed the Byzantines. Kalsokandidis is the same way. They speak disparagingly of the Byzantines constantly, and then are exalting the Ottomans. So that's a good test case. With regards to other non-Ottoman rulers, the problem is since these texts are so focused on Byzantine and Ottoman history, I wouldn't be able to develop enough of a case of an example list, I think, to make a systematic argument. But I do look at what vocabulary they use to describe other potentates. So, for example, there are passages in Dukas where he'd start talking about rulers from, I'm having a hard time thinking of examples, but the Morea before Fatih conquers it, Eastern Europe. I'm having a hard time thinking of examples, but I did look at vocabulary for how they would refer to them, and you'll see there was a complicated series of vocabulary words for referring to leaders some of which had more and less positive connotations. And in general, they would either be using the most positive one for the Ottomans if they were pro-Ottoman, or neutral or negative ones for them. So it's hard to develop a roster of non-Ottoman or Byzantine rulers because they're on Byzantine and Ottoman history. But I'll keep a look at it.
Can we interfere here? A little
Yes,
bit?
maybe at this point we should maybe, announce the order of winners, I guess.
Our rector
that's
is here, Nihat Karakan, and the University Secretary Halit Bal. Because the time is pressing, I know.
Okay, yes. So, let's.
Nobody knows this yet?
Yeah, no, I guess.
You know.
I know, yes.